Christopher Baker's hands trembled as he reached for Henry Kim's face, his fingers barely grazing the warm skin before Henry caught his wrist gently. The question hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, yet here they were, standing at its edge with hearts hammering against their ribs. Henry's dark eyes searched Christopher's face, looking for certainty in the flickering candlelight of the small apartment they'd shared for 3 years as roommates, never as anything more. Utsaru. Henry whispered, his thumb tracing across Christopher's knuckles in a gesture so tender it made Christopher's breath catch. The simple touch sent electricity racing up his arm, the same electricity he'd been trying to ignore for months now, the same current that made him lie awake at night, wondering what it would feel like to wake up in Henry's arms instead of alone in his own bed down the hall. Christopher nodded, not trusting his voice, not trusting anything except the way Henry was looking at him like he was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. This moment had been building for weeks, maybe months, accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon until the pressure became too much to bear. But to understand how they arrived at this precipice, how two best friends found themselves teetering on the edge of everything they thought they knew about themselves, we need to go back to the beginning. 3 months earlier, Christopher had been dating Jessica Howard, a marketing executive with perfectly styled blonde hair and an impressive collection of designer handbags. She was everything his mother had always said he should want in a partner: successful, beautiful, socially connected, and utterly devoted to the idea of their future together. Jessica talked about wedding venues over dinner and sent him links to engagement rings during his lunch breaks at the accounting firm where he worked. She fits seamlessly into his life, or rather, she fits seamlessly into the life he thought he was supposed to want. The problem was that Christopher felt like he was watching his own existence from the outside, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines but kept going through the motions anyway. When Jessica kissed him, he felt nothing but the mechanical pressure of lips against lips. When she talked about their future, he nodded and smiled while his mind wandered to anything else. The stack of reports waiting on his desk, the grocery list stuck to their refrigerator, the way Henry's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at his own terrible jokes. Henry Kim was Christopher's opposite in almost every way. Where Christopher was methodical and careful, Henry was spontaneous and reckless. Where Christopher chose his words with precision, Henry spoke in streams of consciousness that somehow always managed to make perfect sense by the end. Henry was a freelance graphic designer who worked odd hours and survived on coffee and takeout, whose idea of dressing up was putting on jeans without holes in them. He was also the most genuinely happy person Christopher had ever known, the kind of person who found joy in small things. A perfectly brewed cup of coffee, a song that came on the radio at exactly the right moment, the way sunlight hit their living room wall in the late afternoon. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. They'd been roommates since college, a practical arrangement that had somehow evolved into the most important relationship in Christopher's life. Henry knew that Christopher liked his coffee black, but with exactly one sugar cube, that he got anxious during thunderstorms, that he had a secret addiction to terrible reality TV shows that he would never admit to anyone else. In return, Christopher knew that Henry talked to himself when he worked, that he had an irrational fear of butterflies, that he cried during dog food commercials and pretended it was allergies. It was Henry who noticed when Christopher started coming home later and later from his dates with Jessica, who saw the way Christopher's shoulders tensed whenever she called, who finally asked the question that changed everything. "Do you actually like her?" Henry had asked one evening in February, looking up from his laptop where he was working on a logo design for a local coffee shop. Christopher was sitting on their couch, staring at his phone, where Jessica's latest text about weekend plans glowed accusingly on the screen. Quote to Christopher had replied, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Henry closed his laptop and shifted to face him fully, tucking one leg underneath himself in that casual way he had that made Christopher's chest tighten for reasons he couldn't name. Quote 3. The observation hit Christopher like a physical blow, because it was so accurate it hurt. He'd been going through the motions with Jessica for months, showing up because it was expected, because she was a good catch and he was supposed to feel lucky that she'd chosen him. But Henry was right. When Christopher thought about Jessica, he felt obligation and mild fondness, not the breathless excitement that was supposed to come with being in love. Quote 4. Christopher had said weakly, the same thing he'd been telling himself for months. She's stable and successful, and she wants the same things I want. But do you want those things? Henry pressed. And there was something in his voice that made Christopher look at him more closely. Henry's dark eyes were intense, focused on Christopher's face with an attention that made heat creep up Christopher's neck. The question haunted Christopher for days. He found himself examining his life like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. He thought about the house in the suburbs that Jessica wanted them to buy, the 2.5 children she'd already named in her head, the dinner parties they'd host for other successful couples. None of it felt real to him. It felt like a costume he was supposed to wear, a role he was supposed to play. But when he tried to picture himself in that life, the image kept sliding away like water through his fingers. What felt real was coming home to Henry at the end of a long day. What felt real was the way Henry would look up from whatever project he was working on and smile like Christopher's presence was the best part of his day. What felt real was their Saturday morning ritual of sleeping in late and then making elaborate breakfasts while arguing about what music to play. Henry insisting on his indie folk playlists, while Christopher advocated for classic rock. It was during one of these Saturday mornings in early March that Christopher first allowed himself to really look at Henry, to notice the way the morning light caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the way his black hair stalked up at odd angles when he first woke up, the graceful movement of his hands as he flipped pancakes at the stove. Henry was wearing an old college t-shirt that was soft from too many washings, and when he reached up to grab plates from the cabinet, the shirt rode up slightly, revealing a strip of golden skin that made Christopher's mouth go dry. The realization hit him like a lightning strike. He wasn't just noticing Henry's appearance, he was attracted to it. The thought was so foreign, so completely outside the realm of possibilities he'd ever considered for himself, that he actually took a step backward and knocked over his coffee mug. Henry asked, turning from the stove with concern written across his features. He moved quickly to grab paper towels, kneeling down to clean up the spilled coffee while Christopher stood frozen, staring down at the top of Henry's head and feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. "I'm fine," Christopher managed, but his voice came out strained and higher than usual. Henry looked up at him with those perceptive eyes, and Christopher felt like he was being seen through, like Henry could read every confused thought racing through his mind. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost," Henry said, straightening up with the coffee-soaked paper towels in his hand. He was standing close now, close enough that Christopher could smell his shampoo and see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told Christopher about years ago. "Well, shut almost 11. Christopher lied, taking another step back and immediately missing the warmth of Henry's proximity. "I should probably get ready. Jessica and I are supposed to go furniture shopping today." Something flickered across Henry's face at the mention of Jessica, something that looked almost like disappointment. But it was gone so quickly Christopher thought he might have imagined it. Henry nodded and turned back to the stove, but the easy comfort of their morning routine had been broken, replaced by an awkwardness that made Christopher's chest ache. He spent the day trailing behind Jessica through furniture showrooms, nodding at dining room sets and bedroom suites, while his mind replayed the moment in the kitchen over and over again. Jessica chattered about thread counts and wood finishes, her hand possessive on his arm as she steered him from display to display. But Christopher felt like he was underwater, everything muffled and distant. "What do you think about this one?" Jessica asked, running her hand over a mahogany dresser that probably cost more than Christopher made in a month. "It would look perfect in our bedroom." The phrase "our bedroom" should have filled him with anticipation or at least satisfaction, but instead it made him feel trapped, like the walls were closing in around him. He thought about Henry's bedroom down the hall from his own, messy and lived in, with art supplies scattered across the desk and books stacked in precarious towers on every surface. He thought about how many times he'd stood in Henry's doorway talking about their days, how comfortable and right it felt to be in that space, how he'd sometimes lingered longer than necessary just to stay in Henry's presence a little while longer. Quote 16, he said automatically, and Jessica beamed at him like he'd just proposed marriage. That night, Christopher lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what was happening to him. He'd never questioned his sexuality before. He'd dated women throughout high school and college, had relationships that were pleasant, if not passionate, and had always assumed that was just how he was wired. He wasn't the type for grand romantic gestures or overwhelming passion. He was steady and reliable, the kind of man who showed love through consistency rather than fireworks. But as he thought about Henry, about the way his stomach flipped when Henry smiled at him, about how he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his day, Christopher began to wonder if maybe he'd been telling himself the wrong story about who he was. The next few weeks passed in a haze of confusion and hyper-awareness. Christopher found himself cataloging every interaction with Henry, analyzing every glance and touch for meaning that might not be there. When Henry brushed against him, reaching for something in the kitchen, Christopher's skin burned for hours afterward. When Henry fell asleep on the couch during movie night and Christopher covered him with a blanket, the simple act of tucking the fabric around Henry's shoulders felt more intimate than anything he had ever done with Jessica. Meanwhile, his relationship with Jessica continued its steady march toward a future that felt increasingly foreign to him. She started leaving things at his apartment, a toothbrush in the bathroom, a change of clothes in his closet, expensive skincare products that took up half the counter space. Each addition felt like another bar in a cage he hadn't realized he was building around himself. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late March. Christopher had been working late, trying to finish a particularly complex audit, when his phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I have something exciting to tell you." The exclamation points filled him with dread. He knew that tone, knew the breathless excitement that usually preceded Jessica's announcements about their future. The last time she'd texted him like that, it was to tell him she'd found the perfect wedding dress while window shopping with her sister. Before that, it had been about a house she'd seen in a neighborhood she thought would be perfect for raising children. Christopher stared at the message for a long time, his finger hovering over the keyboard as he tried to think of an appropriate response. Finally, he typed back, "See you soon," and immediately felt like he was signing his own death warrant. He drove home slowly, taking the long way through downtown and then sitting in his car in the parking lot of their apartment building for 10 minutes before finally forcing himself to go upstairs. Jessica's car was already in the lot, which meant she was waiting for him, probably with dinner ordered and candles lit and whatever exciting news she was bursting to share. But when Christopher opened the apartment door, he found Jessica and Henry sitting at their small dining table, sharing what looked like Chinese takeout and laughing about something. The sight stopped him in his tracks, not because there was anything inappropriate about it, but because of how natural they looked together, how easy and comfortable, and how completely wrong it felt to see Jessica in his space, at his table, with his person. The possessive thought caught him off guard. Henry wasn't his person, not in the way Christopher's racing heart seemed to think he was. Henry was his roommate and best friend, nothing more, no matter what Christopher's increasingly confused feelings might be telling him. "There he is," Jessica exclaimed, jumping up to kiss him hello. Her lips were warm and soft and tasted like sweet and sour sauce, and Christopher felt absolutely nothing except the desire to step away. "I was just getting to know Henry better. I can't believe we've never really talked before, considering how much time I spend here." Henry was watching them with an expression Christopher couldn't read, something careful and guarded that wasn't like him at all. "I was just telling Jessica about the logo project I'm working on," he said, his voice perfectly pleasant, but somehow lacking its usual warmth. "That's nice," Christopher said, and immediately felt stupid for such a generic response. He sat down at the table, hyper-aware of how Jessica immediately scooted her chair closer to his, while Henry seemed to lean slightly away. "So," Jessica said, practically vibrating with excitement, "I have news." Christopher's stomach dropped. Quote 25, quote 20. She trailed off meaningfully, and Christopher knew she was thinking about engagement rings and wedding planning and all the things that made his chest feel tight with panic. Quote 27. He repeated numbly. Across the table, Henry had gone very still, his chopsticks frozen halfway to his mouth. Quote 28. Jessica continued. Quote 29. Christopher felt like he was drowning. The future Jessica was describing sounded like a prison sentence, but he couldn't find the words to explain why. How could he tell her that the thought of leaving Henry, of moving across the country, and building a life that didn't include his best friend, felt like being asked to cut off his own arm? To 30, he asked, stalling for time. To now I had Jessica said, quote 30. Christopher nodded mechanically, but his eyes were on Henry, who was staring down at his food with an expression that looked almost like grief. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until Henry finally pushed back from the table. He said quietly, "Job 34. He disappeared into his room, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded final. Christopher stared after him, feeling like something important was slipping away from him, but not knowing how to reach for it. Quote 35, Jessica asked, her hand finding his across the table. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth of the apartment, and Christopher had to resist the urge to pull away. Quote 36, he said, which was both true and completely inadequate. What he needed was to understand why the thought of leaving Henry felt like the end of the world, why he'd rather stay in a job he was ambivalent about in a city that was fine, but not special than move somewhere new, with a woman who loved him. Jessica's face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly. She said, the phrase made Christopher's skin crawl, though he couldn't have explained why. He spent the rest of the evening nodding at appropriate intervals while Jessica painted pictures of their hypothetical future in Seattle, but his mind kept drifting to Henry's closed door and the hurt expression he'd glimpsed before Henry had retreated. After Jessica left, Christopher stood outside Henry's room for a long time, his hand raised to knock, but never quite making contact with the wood. He could hear music playing softly inside, one of Henry's melancholy indie playlists that he listened to when he was upset about something. Christopher wanted to knock, wanted to go in and explain that he wasn't going anywhere, but he realized he couldn't make that promise without understanding why it mattered so much. Instead, he went to his own room and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to untangle the knot of emotions in his chest. By the time he fell asleep, he'd reached one conclusion. He needed to figure out what he was feeling for Henry before he could make any decisions about his future with Jessica. The next few days were torture. Henry was polite but distant, making conversation about safe topics like work and the weather, while carefully avoiding anything that felt too personal. He stopped lingering in the kitchen during Christopher's morning coffee routine, stopped suggesting they watch movies together in the evenings, stopped doing all the small things that had made their shared space feel like home. Christopher felt the loss like a physical ache. He'd never realized how much of his daily happiness had been tied to Henry's presence, to their easy intimacy and comfortable silences. Without it, the apartment felt hollow and strange, like a stage set that was missing its most important prop. Jessica, meanwhile, was in full planning mode. She sent him apartment listings from Seattle, restaurant recommendations, articles about the city's cultural scene. Each message felt like another link in a chain he couldn't figure out how to break, especially when he couldn't articulate why he wanted to break it in the first place. The revelation came on a Saturday morning when Christopher woke up early and found Henry in the kitchen, making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. Henry was wearing pajama pants and an old t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep, and he looked so beautiful in the soft light filtering through their small window that Christopher's chest physically hurt. Quote, Christopher asked, and Henry jumped slightly, clearly not having heard him approach. Quote 1, Henry said, not turning around. He was focused intently on the coffee maker, like the simple process of brewing coffee required his complete attention. Christopher moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Henry's skin. About what? Henry was quiet for so long that Christopher thought he wasn't going to answer. Then softly, shut. The words hit Christopher like a punch to the gut, because he could hear the pain in them, could feel how carefully Henry was holding himself together. Without thinking, Christopher reached out and touched Henry's arm, just a brief contact. But Henry went very still under his fingers. Henry, Christopher started, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could he explain that he was falling in love with his best friend when he'd only just admitted it to himself? How could he say that the thought of losing Henry was more terrifying than any other fear he'd ever faced? Henry finally turned to look at him, and Christopher saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression, something that made his breath catch. Quote 45, Henry asked quietly. "Shuip Hannah?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Christopher opened his mouth to give the automatic response, the one he'd been giving himself for months. But the lie wouldn't come. Standing here in their kitchen in the early morning light, with Henry looking at him like his answer mattered more than anything in the world, Christopher couldn't pretend anymore. "No," he whispered, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff. Henry's eyes widened slightly, and Christopher saw something that looked like hope flicker across his face before he carefully schooled his expression back to neutral. Quote 49. Christopher felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to say something that would change everything between them. But looking at Henry, seeing the careful way he was holding himself, Christopher realized that maybe everything had already changed. Maybe it had been changing for months, so gradually that he hadn't noticed until it was too late to pretend otherwise. "Because she's not you," he said, the words falling out of him before he could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry stared at him with wide eyes, his lips slightly parted in surprise, and Christopher felt his face burn with embarrassment and terror. He'd just confessed his feelings to a straight best friend, had just ruined the most important relationship in his life, and there was no way to take it back. Quote 51. Henry said softly, and there was something in his voice that made Christopher look up despite his mortification. Henry was looking at him with an expression Christopher had never seen before, tender and amazed, and something else that made Christopher's heart hammer against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, Henry reached out and cupped Christopher's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across Christopher's cheekbones in a gesture so gentle it made Christopher's eyes flutter closed. Quote 52. Henry whispered, and then he was kissing him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like Henry was giving Christopher a chance to pull away. But Christopher had no intention of pulling away. Instead, he melted into the contact, his hands finding Henry's waist and pulling him closer. Henry tasted like coffee and toothpaste, and something that was uniquely him. And Christopher thought dimly that this was what kissing was supposed to feel like coming home and flying apart at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against Christopher's and smiled that crooked smile that Christopher loved so much. Quote 53. Christopher asked, his voice rough with emotion. Quote 54. Henry asked, and Christopher nodded. Christopher thought about all the moments he'd cataloged over the past few months, all the times he'd felt that electric connection and dismissed it as imagination. Quote 50 and quote Arnon, Henry replied. Quote Watson, quote Funkes. Christopher said fiercely, and Henry's smile widened. What about Jessica? Henry asked, and Christopher felt a stab of guilt. He'd been so caught up in his revelation about Henry that he'd momentarily forgotten about the woman who was planning their future together in Seattle. I have to end it, Christopher said. I should have ended it months ago. I've been lying to both of us, trying to force something that was never going to work. Henry nodded, but Christopher could see the worry in his eyes. Are you sure? I don't want to be the reason you give up something that could make you happy. You're not the reason I'm giving it up, Christopher said, taking Henry's hands in his own. They talked until the sun came up, sitting on their couch with Henry's head on Christopher's shoulder, sharing stories about all the moments when they had almost figured it out, all the times they'd caught each other staring or lingering in touches that lasted a beat too long. Christopher learned that Henry had been jealous of Jessica from the beginning, that he'd spent countless nights lying awake wishing he could be the one Christopher came home to with stories about his day. Henry learned that Christopher had been comparing every woman he'd ever dated to him without realizing it, that no relationship had ever felt right because he'd been looking for something he already had but hadn't known how to name. Breaking up with Jessica was one of the hardest things Christopher had ever had to do, not because he was heartbroken, but because she was. She cried and asked what she'd done wrong, and Christopher had to find a way to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes people just aren't compatible in ways that have nothing to do with fault or failure. Is there someone else? She asked through her tears, and Christopher hesitated before nodding. Yes, he said quietly, but it's not what you think. It's not someone I was cheating with or someone new. It's someone I should have realized I had feelings for a long time ago. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, wiping her eyes with a tissue. It's Henry, isn't it? Christopher's eyes widened in surprise. She said with a sad smile. "Kaya nastun na quote assuredin." Christopher said, meaning it completely. Quote Arnden, quote Hound, she said, and there was strength in her voice despite the tears. Quote Sal, they hugged goodbye, and Christopher felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he was finally free to be honest about who he was and what he wanted, sadness that it had taken him so long to figure it out, and that Jessica had been hurt in the process. When he got home, Henry was waiting for him with dinner and a bottle of wine, and they spent the evening talking about what came next. They decided to take things slowly, to give themselves time to adjust to the shift from friendship to romance. But Christopher found that being with Henry romantically felt as natural as breathing. They fit together perfectly, like puzzle pieces that had been waiting their whole lives to find their match. 3 months later, they were standing in their kitchen again, but everything was different now. Henry was wearing the ring Christopher had given him the week before, a simple silver band that caught the light when he moved his hands. They'd been talking about making their relationship official, about telling their families and friends, about building a life together that acknowledged what they meant to each other. "Are you nervous?" Henry asked, and Christopher realized they'd come full circle to the moment where this story began, with Henry's hands cupping his face and the question of certainty hanging between them. "No," Christopher said, and he meant it. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Henry smiled that beautiful smile that had been making Christopher's heart race for months now, and leaned in to kiss him. This kiss was different from their first one in the pre-dawn kitchen light. This one was full of certainty and promise. The kiss of two people who had found their way home to each other despite taking the long way around. When they broke apart, Henry rested his forehead against Christopher's, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily from the intensity of the moment. "I love you," Henry whispered, and Christopher felt the words settle into his chest like they'd been waiting there his whole life. "Tapataderim," Christopher replied and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Tchadechwan," Henry said, his thumb tracing along Christopher's jawline in that gentle way that never failed to make Christopher's knees weak. Quote, Christopher thought about the path that had brought them to this moment. All the confusion and false starts and moments of almost recognition that had finally led to this clarity. He thought about Jessica, who was probably settling into her new life in Seattle by now, and felt a pang of gratitude for her role in helping him understand what he didn't want. He thought about all the years he'd spent going through the motions of a life that didn't fit him, and felt amazed at how right everything felt now. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, reading the contemplative expression on Christopher's face with the ease of someone who had been studying that face for years. "Quote on," Christopher said. Quote answer, quote answer, quote. Henry's smile was radiant, and Christopher felt that familiar flutter in his chest that he now recognized as love, pure and simple. It was strange how something so fundamental could have been hiding in plain sight for so long, disguised as friendship and roommate compatibility, and all the other safe label he'd used to avoid examining his feelings too closely. Quotient, Christopher continued, voicing the thought that had been nagging at him for weeks. Quote, quotation, Henry said softly, tilting Christopher's chin up so their eyes met. "We weren't ready before. I don't think either of us could have handled this until now. You needed to figure out who you were and what you wanted, and I needed to learn how to be brave enough to risk our friendship for something more." Christopher knew Henry was right, but it was still hard not to feel regret for all the nights they had spent in separate beds, all the mornings when they danced around each other in the kitchen without acknowledging the electricity between them, all the times Christopher had come home from disappointing dates and wished he could just stay in with Henry instead. "Besides," Henry added with a mischievous grin, "think of it this way. We got to be best friends first. How many couples can say they genuinely like each other as much as they love each other?" The observation made Christopher laugh, and he felt some of the weight of regret lift from his shoulders. Henry was right. Their friendship had been the foundation for everything else, and that foundation was solid in a way that would serve them well in the years to come. "So what now?" Christopher asked. "I mean, I know what I want, but I want to make sure we're on the same page." "What do you want?" Henry asked. And there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer, but wanted to hear Christopher say it. "I want everything," Christopher said without hesitation. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to fight about what to watch on Netflix and whose turn it is to do the dishes. I want to meet your family as your boyfriend and introduce you to mine the same way. I want to travel together and build a home together and figure out what the rest of our lives look like together." Henry's eyes had grown bright with emotion during Christopher's speech, and when Christopher finished, Henry pulled him into another kiss, this one fierce with joy and promise. "That's exactly what I want too," Henry said against Christopher's lips. Quote 1 or 2. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about practical things like whether to get a bigger apartment or stay in their current one, whether to adopt a dog like they'd been joking about for years, when to start telling people about their relationship. But underneath all the logistics was a current of pure happiness, the joy of two people who had found their person and were ready to build a life together. Later that night, as they lay in Henry's bed, Christopher's head on Henry's chest and Henry's fingers running through his hair, Christopher felt a peace he'd never experienced before. For so long, he'd felt like he was acting in a play where everyone else knew their lines, but he was improvising, hoping no one would notice that he didn't belong. Now, finally, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was supposed to be with. Quote 103, he said softly into the darkness. Quote 1. Henry's arms tightened around him. "Thank you for being worth waiting for," he replied, "and for being brave enough to let yourself feel something you didn't expect." Christopher smiled against Henry's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He thought about how scared he'd been just a few months ago, how the idea of loving Henry had seemed impossible and terrifying. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something that had always been true and was just waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. "I love you," he whispered, still amazed at how easily the words came now, how right they felt in his mouth. "I love you too," Henry replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Christopher's head. 112. As Christopher drifted off to sleep, safe and warm in Henry's arms, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been straightforward or easy, and there had been moments when he'd thought he might lose Henry entirely. But somehow they'd found their way to each other, had managed to transform their friendship into something deeper and more beautiful than Christopher had ever imagined possible. The next morning, Christopher woke up before Henry, something that rarely happened since Henry was usually the early riser between them. He lay still for a moment, savoring the unfamiliar but wonderful sensation of waking up beside someone he loved, someone who loved him back completely and without reservation. Henry's face was peaceful in sleep, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made Christopher's chest tight with affection. Carefully, so as not to wake him, Christopher slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen to start the coffee. It was a Saturday morning, which meant they had nowhere to be and nothing to do except enjoy each other's company. As the coffee brewed, Christopher found himself thinking about all the Saturday mornings they'd shared as roommates, how comfortable and natural their routine had been even before they had acknowledged their feelings for each other. "Starting without me?" Henry's voice came from behind him, rough with sleep and tinged with amusement. Christopher turned to find Henry standing in the doorway, wearing just pajama pants and looking rumpled and beautiful in the morning light. Even after months of being together, the sight of Henry still made Christopher's pulse quicken, still filled him with wonder that this incredible person had chosen to love him. "Just getting things ready," Christopher said, opening his arms. Henry crossed the kitchen and melted into the embrace, nuzzling against Christopher's neck in a way that made him shiver. Henry murmured against his skin. Quote 100 stone, Christopher replied, pressing a kiss to Henry's temple. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Henry said, pulling back to look at Christopher with eyes that were soft with contentment. "I still can't quite believe this is real sometimes." Christopher understood the feeling completely. Even now, months into their relationship, there were moments when he felt like he might wake up and discover it had all been an elaborate dream. The happiness felt too good to be true, too perfect to last, but every day that passed without the other shoe dropping made him believe a little more that this was his new reality. It's real, Spy, real, he said, cupping Henry's face in his hands. Quote 121. Henry smiled and leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Christopher's heart clench. I keep waiting for you to change your mind, Henry admitted quietly, to decide that this was all a mistake and you want to go back to how things were before. The confession hit Christopher like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because he recognized the fear behind it. He'd had similar thoughts himself, moments of panic where he worried that Henry would realize he could do better, that he deserved someone who had figured themselves out earlier and hadn't put him through months of uncertainty. Never, Christopher said fiercely. Henry, look at me. I am never going to change my mind about this, about us. What we have is the most real thing in my life. You're the most real thing in my life. Henry's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Whatever he saw there seemed to reassure him because his shoulders relaxed and his smile returned. Quote Pawan, he said simply. Quote watch it, quote one, Christopher said, pressing a soft kiss to Henry's lips, because I plan on spending the rest of my life proving it to you. They made breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen with the easy choreography they'd developed over years of shared mornings. But now there were new elements to their dance, Henry's hand trailing across Christopher's back as he passed behind him. Christopher pausing to press a kiss to Henry's shoulder as he reached around him for the orange juice, small touches and gestures that spoke of intimacy and belonging. As they sat at their small table sharing pancakes and coffee, Christopher felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Not just for Henry, though he was grateful for Henry in ways that went beyond words, but for the journey that had brought them here. Even the difficult parts, the confusion and heartbreak and false starts, had been necessary. They taught him who he was and what he wanted, had prepared him to recognize and appreciate what he had with Henry. Quote 130. Henry asked, and Christopher realized he'd been staring. Just thinking about how lucky I am, Christopher said honestly. We both are, Henry replied, reaching across the table to take Christopher's hand. Quote 130. Christopher squeezed Henry's fingers, thinking about all the relationships he'd had before, all the ways he'd tried to force himself into shapes that didn't fit. Quote 134, he said. Quote 135, and quote 136, Henry suggested. Quote 137 days. The idea resonated with Christopher in a way that made his chest warm. It reframed all his past relationships not as failures or mistakes, but as stepping stones that had led him to Henry. Even Jessica, despite the pain of their breakup, had played a crucial role in helping him understand what he didn't want, which had been necessary for recognizing what he did want when it was right in front of him. I like that, Christopher said. It makes everything feel more intentional, I guess. Like we were always going to end up here, we just took the scenic route. Henry laughed, the sound bright and joyful in their small kitchen. The very scenic route. But we made it. We made it, Christopher agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. They spent the rest of the morning in comfortable domesticity, reading the newspaper and arguing good-naturedly about politics, planning their grocery list for the week, discussing whether they should finally get around to painting the living room. It was ordinary and perfect, the kind of morning Christopher had dreamed of without knowing he was dreaming of it. Around noon, Henry's phone rang and he glanced at the screen with a slight frown. He said, and Christopher felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Henry had been talking about introducing Christopher to his parents as his boyfriend, but they hadn't set a specific timeline for it. You should answer it, Christopher said, trying to keep his voice casual. Henry hesitated for a moment, then swiped to accept the call. Hi, Mom, he said, and Christopher could hear the warmth in his voice that always appeared when Henry talked to his family. Christopher tried not to eavesdrop, but their apartment was small and Henry's side of the conversation was hard to ignore. It sounded like a typical check-in call at first, Henry updating his mother on work and life in general. But then Christopher heard him take a deep breath and his attention sharpened. Henry said, his eyes finding Christopher across the room. Quote 146. Christopher's heart started beating faster, and he tried to look busy organizing the newspapers while straining to hear both sides of the conversation. His name is Christopher, Henry continued, and Christopher felt a thrill at hearing Henry claim him so openly, so proudly. You actually know about him. He's my roommate, the one I've been telling you stories about for years. There was a pause, and then Henry laughed, the sound relieved and happy. Yeah, I know it might seem sudden, but it really isn't. I think I've been in love with him for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it. And he felt the same way. Christopher abandoned any pretense of not listening and moved closer, wanting to be part of this moment, even if he could only hear half of it. Henry reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently while he continued talking to his mother. I'm really happy, Mom, Henry said, his voice soft with emotion. Happier than I've ever been. I can't wait for you to meet him properly, as my boyfriend this time, instead of just my roommate. Christopher felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. The casual way Henry said, my boyfriend, like it was the most natural thing in the world, made something in his chest expand with joy and pride. Okay, I'll ask him, Henry said, then looked at Christopher with raised eyebrows. My mom wants to know if you'd like to come to dinner next Sunday. She's making her famous lasagna, and she says it's time she got to know the person who's been making her son so happy. Christopher nodded eagerly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Meeting Henry's parents as his boyfriend felt like a huge step, but it was one he was more than ready to take. Henry told his mother, grinning at Christopher's obvious enthusiasm. We'll be there at 6. The rest of the phone call was logistics and Henry's mother apparently asking questions about their relationship because Henry kept laughing and saying things like, quote, 157 and quote, 158. When he finally hung up, Henry immediately pulled Christopher into his arms, spinning him around their small living room until they were both laughing and breathless. Quote, 159. Henry said when he set Christopher down, quote, 160. Quote, 161. Christopher asked, curious about Henry's parents' reaction. He'd met them a few times over the years, always as Henry's roommate, and they'd seemed like warm, accepting people. But he knew that accepting your child's roommate and accepting your child's same-sex partner were very different things. She said she just wants me to be happy. And if you make me happy, then she loves you already, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. Then she asked if we were planning to get married, which I told her was a conversation for another day. Christopher felt his cheeks heat up at the mention of marriage. They'd been together for months now, but they hadn't really talked about long-term plans beyond the general agreement that they wanted to build a life together. The idea of marrying Henry, of making their commitment official and legal, sent a thrill through him that was equal parts excitement and terror. Too soon for that conversation? Henry asked, clearly reading Christopher's expression. Quote, 165. Christopher said quickly. Quote, wasam, quote, oaxen, Henry said gently. Quote, saidism, The simple statement hit Christopher like a lightning bolt. Henry was essentially proposing, or at least pre-proposing, telling him that whenever Christopher was ready to take that step, Henry would be ready too. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to him, and it was so perfectly Henry, practical and emotional at the same time. Quote 169, Christopher said, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 170, Henry's smile was radiant, and he pulled Christopher into a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling so hard their cheeks hurt. I love you, Henry said, resting his forehead against Christopher's. Quote 172, Christopher replied and marveled again at how easily the words came, how right they felt. The week leading up to dinner with Henry's parents passed in a blur of nervous excitement. Christopher found himself overthinking everything. What to wear, what to bring, how to act, what to say if they asked about his previous relationships, or how he'd figured out he was gay. Henry was endlessly patient with his anxiety, reassuring him that his parents already liked him and that nothing fundamental had changed except the context of their relationship. Quote 173. Henry promised on Saturday night because Christopher tried on his third outfit of the evening. Quote, when Christopher said, tugging at his shirt. Quote, and Henry crossed the room and took Christopher's hands in his, stilling his nervous fidgeting. Then I'll tell them that sexuality is complicated and that it doesn't matter when you figured it out. What matters is that you did, and that you chose me. The simple statement calmed Christopher's racing thoughts. Henry was right. The details of his journey to understanding his sexuality were less important than where he'd ended up. What mattered was that he loved Henry and Henry loved him, and they were building something real and lasting together. You're right, Christopher said, taking a deep breath. I'm overthinking this. You're nervous because it matters to you, Henry said gently. Because you want them to like you and approve of us. That's sweet, and it's one of the reasons I love you so much. But they're going to love you, Christopher. How could they not? Sunday evening arrived faster than Christopher had expected, and before he knew it, they were standing on the front porch of Henry's childhood home. Christopher clutching a bottle of wine and trying to calm his racing heart. The house was warm and inviting, with a garden full of flowers and the sound of laughter coming from inside. Henry squeezed his hand once before ringing the doorbell, and Christopher felt some of his nervousness fade. Whatever happened, they were in this together. The door opened to reveal Henry's mother, Nancy Taylor, a petite woman with graying hair and Henry's same warm brown eyes. She looked at Christopher for a moment, and then her face broke into a huge smile. She said, pulling him into a hug before he could react. The warmth of her greeting dissolved the last of Christopher's anxiety. This was the same woman who had always been kind to him during his brief interactions with her over the years, and her acceptance of his relationship with Henry felt genuine and complete. Thank you for having me, Nancy Taylor, Christopher said when she released him from the hug. I brought wine. How thoughtful, she said, taking the bottle and ushering them inside. Eugene Collins is in the kitchen, pretending to help with dinner, but mostly just getting in my way. Eugene Collins, they're here. Henry's father appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel and grinning at them both. He was taller than Henry, with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes, and when he looked at Christopher, there was nothing but warmth and welcome in his expression. What pardon, he said, extending his hand. The comment made Christopher blush, but it also filled him with a deep sense of belonging. Henry's parents weren't just accepting their relationship, they were embracing it, celebrating it, treating it like the natural and wonderful thing it was. Dinner was everything Christopher had hoped it would be. Nancy Taylor's lasagna was indeed famous for good reason, and the conversation flowed easily between the four of them. Henry's parents asked about Christopher's work, his family, his interests, the same kinds of questions they would ask any of Henry's partners. But they also asked about their relationship specifically, how they'd realized their feelings for each other, what their plans were, how Christopher's family had reacted to the news. Quoted, Christopher admitted when Nancy Taylor asked about his family's response. They're trying to be supportive, but I think they're confused about why I dated women for so long if I'm gay. It's hard for them to understand that sexuality can be fluid, that sometimes it takes time to figure yourself out. People understand the world through their own experiences, Eugene Collins said thoughtfully. For some people, their sexuality is clear from a young age. For others, it's more of a journey. Neither way is right or wrong. They're just different paths to the same destination. The acceptance and wisdom in his words made Christopher's eyes water slightly. He'd been so worried about judgment or confusion, but Henry's parents seemed to understand intuitively that love was love, regardless of the path that led to it. Wood Nancy Taylor added, reaching across the table to squeeze Christopher's hand, and that you make each other happy. Anyone can see how much you two love each other. After dinner, they moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, and Christopher found himself relaxing completely for the first time all week. Henry's parents shared stories about his childhood, embarrassing him with tales of his artistic phases and teenage dramatics, and Christopher contributed his own stories about Henry's quirks and habits as a roommate. He still talks to himself when he's working, Christopher said, grinning at Henry's mock-offended expression. Quote 127, quote 188. Nancy Taylor laughed, quote pointing, quote O'Harno, Christopher asked, delighted by this new piece of Henry trivia. Quote Tuan, Henry said with dignity, quote 20. The easy teasing and shared laughter made Christopher feel like he was already part of the family, like his relationship with Henry had simply expanded the circle of love and acceptance rather than changing it fundamentally. It was exactly what he'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. As the evening wound down, Nancy Taylor pulled Christopher aside while Henry and his father were loading the dishwasher. Quote, 203, quote, she said quietly, her voice serious despite the smile on her face. Quote, 204, Christopher asked, confused. Quote, 205, she said simply. Quote, Town, Christopher felt tears prick at his eyes again. Quote, Tavin, he said. Quote, Twana, quote, Dwana, Nancy Taylor said, patting his arm gently. Quote, Twanton. The drive home was quiet but comfortable, both of them processing the evening and feeling grateful for how well it had gone. Christopher stared out the window at the passing streetlights and felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Henry's parents had welcomed him not just as Henry's boyfriend, but as a potential future son-in-law, someone who was already part of the family in all the ways that mattered. Quote 211, Henry said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Quote 212, Christopher replied. Quote 203 and quote different, Henry said simply. Quote Town, Christopher protested. Quote Town, Henry said, reaching over to take Christopher's hand. That's all you ever have to be with the people who matter. Just yourself. The simple statement hit Christopher with unexpected force. For so much of his life, he'd felt like he was performing, trying to be the person he thought others wanted him to be. With Jessica, he tried to be the ambitious boyfriend who wanted a suburban future. With his co-workers, he tried to be the reliable team player who never rocked the boat. Even with his own family, sometimes he felt like he was playing a role rather than being authentic. But with Henry, he'd never had to pretend to be anyone other than who he was. Henry had fallen in love with the real Christopher, messy and confused and imperfect as he was. And now Henry's parents had done the same thing, accepting him completely without requiring him to change or perform or prove himself worthy of their son's love. Quote Tutuhuan, Christopher said, squeezing Henry's hand. I love you too, Henry replied, bringing Christopher's knuckles to his lips for a soft kiss. When they got home, they settled on their couch with cups of tea, Christopher curled against Henry's side while they debriefed the evening. It felt like a milestone had been passed, like they had officially crossed some invisible threshold from a new relationship to something more established and recognized. Quote Todun, Christopher asked, idly lying with the buttons on Henry's shirt. What do you mean? I mean, we've told our families we're living together. We're talking about marriage eventually. What's the next step in this relationship? Henry was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I think the next step is just living that, he said finally. Building our life together day by day, making decisions together, creating traditions and memories and all the little things that make a relationship a partnership. Christopher nodded, understanding what Henry meant. They'd covered the big milestones relatively quickly, but the real work of a relationship, was in the daily choices to love and support and choose each other over and over again. Quote Tussit, he said. Quote Twana, quote on, Henry agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Christopher's head. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Christopher found himself thinking about the future, about all the ordinary moments and extraordinary milestones they'd share. He thought about lazy Sunday mornings and stressful work weeks, about holidays with their families and vacations to places they'd never been. He thought about the possibility of buying a house together, of adopting the dog they'd been joking about, of growing old together and still finding reasons to laugh every day. Quote 230. Henry's voice pulled him out of his reverie. Yeah? Are you happy? Really, truly happy? Christopher lifted his head to look at Henry, seeing something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. It was the same question Henry had asked him months ago in their kitchen, the question that had started this whole journey. But now Christopher's answer was completely different. Quote 233, he said without hesitation. Quote Tuan, Henry's smile was radiant, and he pulled Christopher up for a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of all the love they'd found together. Henry whispered against his lips. Christopher smiled and settled back against Henry's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling completely at peace. Outside, the world continued its chaotic spin, full of uncertainty and change and all the complications that came with being human. But here, in their small apartment, with the man he loved more than he'd ever thought possible, Christopher felt like he'd found his anchor, his home, his person. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about all the confusion and false starts and moments of doubt that had seemed so overwhelming at the time. Now he could see that every step had been necessary. Every mistake and revelation and moment of clarity had been leading him to this, to Henry, to love, to the life they were building together one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. "I love you," he whispered into the quiet of their living room. "I love you too," Henry replied, his arms tightening around Christopher in a gesture of protection and possession and promise. And in that moment, Christopher knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the person he was meant to love, living exactly the life he was supposed to live. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and adventures, and all the beautiful mundane moments that made up a life shared with someone you love completely. 6 months later, Christopher stood in their newly painted living room, watching Henry hang the last of their framed photographs on the wall they designated as their memory wall. The apartment looked different now, more intentionally theirs rather than just a space they happened to share. They'd bought a new couch together, one that was big enough for them both to stretch out on during movie nights. They'd replaced Henry's mismatched dishes with a proper set they'd chosen together, arguing good-naturedly about patterns and colors until they'd found something they both loved. The memory wall was Henry's idea, a collection of photographs that told the story of their relationship and their individual journeys to each other. There were pictures from their college days, back when they were just friends who happened to live together. There were photos from various gatherings and celebrations over the years, and Christopher could see now what Jessica had seen, the way he and Henry gravitated toward each other in every group shot, the way they looked at each other even when they weren't supposed to be the focus of the photograph. But his favorite pictures were the new ones, their first official date to the art museum downtown, the weekend they'd spent at Henry's parents' lake house, the day they'd adopted Mochi, the small gray cat who was currently napping in a patch of sunlight by the window. In these recent photos, there was no hiding, no pretending, no careful distance maintained for the sake of appearances. They looked like what they were, two people deeply in love, comfortable with each other, and secure in their relationship. "What do you think?" Henry asked, stepping back to survey his work. "Perfect," Christopher said, and he meant it. The wall was a beautiful representation of their journey, from friendship to love to partnership, and seeing it all laid out like that filled him with a profound sense of gratitude. "I was thinking we could add to it over time," Henry said, slipping his arms around Christopher from behind. "Wedding photos, vacation pictures, maybe someday photos of kids if we decide we want them." The casual mention of marriage and children sent a familiar thrill through Christopher's chest. They'd been talking more seriously about both topics lately, not making concrete plans but acknowledging that they were both thinking about a shared future that included legal commitment and possibly expanding their family. "I'd like that," Christopher said, leaning back against Henry's chest. Diamond. They stood there for a moment, looking at their memory wall and thinking about all the memories still to be made. Christopher thought about how different his life was now from what he'd imagined it would be a year ago. He'd thought he was on a clear path toward a conventional future with Jessica, toward suburban domesticity and all the markers of success he'd been taught to want. Now he was living in the same small apartment he'd shared with Henry for years. But everything about it felt different because everything about him was different. He'd learned that happiness wasn't about checking boxes or meeting expectations. It was about finding the person who made you feel most like yourself and building a life with them that honored who you both were. He'd learned that love didn't always look the way you expected it to, but when it was real, when it was right, it felt like coming home. Henry said suddenly, pulling away and moving toward their bedroom. "Code 246. Christopher called after him, curious. "Quote 247, Henry replied, returning with a small, wrapped box that made Christopher's heart start beating faster. "Just wanted to give you something." Christopher took the box with trembling fingers, his mind racing. It was too small to be anything but jewelry, and given the conversations they'd been having lately about marriage, he thought he knew what it might be. But they hadn't talked about proposals or timelines, hadn't made any concrete plans beyond the general agreement that they wanted to spend their lives together. Quote 249. He started, but Henry shook his head. Quote 250. Henry said softly, his eyes bright with excitement and nervousness. Christopher carefully unwrapped the box, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a simple silver band, elegant and understated, exactly the kind of ring he would have chosen for himself if he'd been shopping for one. It's not an engagement ring, Henry said quickly, reading the question in Christopher's eyes. Quote 252. Christopher lifted the ring from the box, admiring the way it caught the light. Engraved on the inside in Henry's familiar handwriting were the words, "Exactly where I belong." "Henry," Christopher breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I know we haven't talked about proposals or wedding planning or any of that," Henry continued, his words coming out in a rush. "But I wanted you to have something that showed how serious I am about us, about our future. I want everyone to know that you're taken, that you're mine, and I'm yours." Christopher looked up at Henry, seeing the vulnerability and love in his expression, and felt his heart expand with so much affection he thought it might burst. The ring was perfect. The gesture was perfect. The timing was perfect, even though it wasn't planned or orchestrated. Quote 257. Christopher asked, holding out his left hand. Henry's smile was radiant as he took the ring and slipped it onto Christopher's ring finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for him, and when Christopher looked down at his hand, he felt a deep sense of rightness settle over him. Quote 258, he said, then looked up at Henry with tears in his eyes. Quote, "Toi, quote, Henry replied, pulling Christopher into a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Christopher admired the ring again, thinking about what it represented. It was a symbol of their commitment, yes, but it was also a symbol of how far they'd both come, how much they'd grown and changed and learned about themselves and each other. Quote 61, Christopher asked with a smile. Quote Sautun, Henry laughed. Quote Tarleton, quote Tarleton, Christopher said. Quote Yarson, quote Times. Henry agreed, taking Christopher's hand and admiring the way the ring looked on his finger. Although I have to warn you, I'm probably going to start referring to you as my fiancé now. And I'm going to start referring to you as mine, Christopher replied, loving the way the words sounded, loving the way it felt to claim Henry so openly and completely. They spent the rest of the evening celebrating in quiet ways, ordering takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant, opening a bottle of champagne Henry had been saving for a special occasion, curling up on their new couch with Mochi purring between them while they made plans for their future. "When do you think we'll actually get married?" Christopher asked as they were getting ready for bed, both of them brushing their teeth at their bathroom sink in the domestic routine they'd perfected over months of sharing space as a couple. Quote 270, Henry said after rinsing his mouth. Quote Tuan, Christopher suggested. Quote, Henry's face lit up at the suggestion. "They would love that. My mom would probably cry for a week straight from happiness." "Mine might too once she gets used to the idea," Christopher said. His parents had been slower to accept his relationship with Henry, not because they disapproved, but because they were genuinely confused by his late-in-life realization about his sexuality. But they were trying, and Christopher could see them warming up to Henry more each time they spent time together. "We have time to figure it all out," Henry said, wrapping his arms around Christopher from behind as they stood in front of the bathroom mirror. No rush, no pressure. Christopher looked at their reflection, at the way they fit together, at the happiness evident in both their faces. The ring on his finger caught the light, and he thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how it could surprise you in the most beautiful ways when you least expected it. A year ago, he'd been planning a future with someone else, going through the motions of a life that didn't fit him, but that he thought he was supposed to want. Now he was planning a future with his best friend, the person who knew him better than anyone else in the world, the person who made him feel most like himself. "I can't wait to marry you," Christopher said softly, meeting Henry's eyes in the mirror. Quote 279. Henry replied, pressing a kiss to Christopher's temple. "But I'm also perfectly happy just being engaged to be engaged for now." "Me too," Christopher agreed, turning in Henry's arms to face him properly. Quote 282, quote 283, Henry asked, echoing the words they'd said to each other so many times over the past months. "With exactly who I want to be with," Christopher confirmed, then kissed Henry softly, tasting toothpaste and happiness, and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd share together. As they settled into bed that night, Christopher's new ring catching the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been straightforward or simple, and there had been times when he'd thought he might lose Henry entirely. Times when he'd been so confused about his own feelings that he'd nearly made choices that would have taken him away from this happiness. But somehow, despite all the uncertainty and false starts and moments of doubt, they'd found their way to each other. They'd managed to transform their friendship into something deeper and more beautiful than Christopher had ever imagined possible. And now they were planning a future together that felt both surprising and inevitable. "Henry?" Christopher said softly into the darkness of their bedroom. Henry replied, his voice already heavy with sleep. "Thank you for waiting for me to figure it out, for being patient while I was so confused about everything." Henry's arms tightened around him. "Kutahadadinanate," he said, the same words he'd said months ago, but with even more conviction now. "And for being brave enough to choose love, even when it wasn't what you expected." Christopher smiled against Henry's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling completely at peace. Outside their window, the city continued its restless movement, full of other people finding their way to love, or losing it, or searching for it in all the wrong places. But here, in their small bedroom, with the man he loved more than he'd ever thought possible, Christopher felt like he'd found the center of his universe, the still point around which everything else could spin safely. He thought about all the people who might be listening to their story, people who were struggling with their own questions about sexuality and love and identity. He hoped that somehow their journey might offer comfort or hope to someone who was feeling as lost and confused as he'd felt just a year ago. He hoped that their story might be proof that it was never too late to figure out who you were, never too late to choose authenticity over expectation, never too late to find the love that made you feel most like yourself. "I love you," he whispered into the quiet of their bedroom, the words as true now as they'd been the first time he'd said them, but deeper somehow, richer with all the experiences and choices and small daily acts of love that had brought them to this moment. "I love you too," Henry replied, his voice soft with sleep and contentment. "Sweet dreams, my almost fiancé." Christopher smiled at the phrase, at the perfect balance of commitment and playfulness and that characterized so much of their relationship. "Sweet dreams, my almost fiancé," he replied, and felt sleep begin to pull him under, safe and warm in Henry's arms, exactly where he belonged. As he drifted off to sleep, Christopher thought about the morning that would come, about waking up beside Henry and seeing his ring in the daylight, about all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that stretched out before them. He thought about wedding planning and meeting with Henry's extended family and figuring out whether they wanted to adopt another cat to keep Moshi company. He thought about growing old together, about all the ways they'd change and grow while their love remained constant. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was to have found his person, to have discovered that the love he'd been searching for his whole life had been right there beside him, waiting patiently for him to be ready to see it. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories, he reflected drowsily, were the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that transformed friendship into something deeper and more lasting than you had ever imagined possible. And sometimes, he thought as his sleep finally claimed him, the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries. The dare to be honest about who you were, the dare to risk a friendship for the possibility of something more, the dare to choose love even when it didn't look the way you'd expected it to. In the morning, they would wake up together in the bed they shared, in the apartment they'd made into a home, in the life they were building together one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. Christopher would see his ring in the daylight and feel that same thrill of recognition and belonging he'd felt when Henry had first slipped it onto his finger. Henry would make coffee while Christopher fed Mochi, and they'd sit at their small table sharing breakfast and planning their day, and it would be perfect in its simplicity. But for now, Christopher was content to drift off to sleep in Henry's arms, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. He was exactly where he needed to be, with exactly the person he was meant to love, living exactly the life he was supposed to live. And that knowledge, that certainty, was worth all the confusion and heartbreak and searching that had come before it. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, and Christopher Baker had never been more grateful to be surprised by love than he was in this moment, falling asleep beside Henry Kim with a promise ring on his finger and a future full of possibilities stretching out before them like an unwritten book, waiting to be filled with all the adventures and quiet moments and daily acts of love that would make up their life together.